Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the show. It's Merlin Fulcher. This is the 2nd of June, Tuesday evening. As you can see, it's been a while since I've done an episode of this show, and it's probably just because there's been quite a lot of quite disturbing things going on, really. I set up this as a platform to discuss visuals and images and important themes that were kind of dominating the world in our media at a time of massive change. And the last week has been extraordinary, and to be frank, it's probably the images that I've been seeing have probably come at me at a pace and of a kind of magnitude that I've been unable to deal with, and it's taken me a while to think about and to kind of digest these things and think about what it all means. And obviously what I'm talking about is the murder of George Floyd, and this happened on the Monday the 25th of May, so that's just 8 days ago. And this is a horrific thing. It's a police murder. It's an extrajudicial killing that happened in the United States, in Minnesota, of a man, a black American man who was effectively police were trying to arrest him, and a knee was placed on his neck in some kind of sort of hold, quite extreme thing that to do to anybody, and it's very important to look at the details and to read the details of this, because what happened is this police officer put their knee on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes, right? 8 minutes, and think about that. That's a very, very long time. And from what the facts say, 2 minutes of that 8 minutes, he was incapacitated, and that he had no pulse. So effectively, right there on the spot, he was killed by a police officer. And this issue is extremely important because this affects every single person, yeah, and it has massive ramifications for what we need to do, what everybody needs to do as we go forward, as we try to create a better society. It affects our built environment and everybody involved in shaping our built environments, and it really goes to the core of what we need to do together if we're going to overcome things like this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I think, coming back to the theme of images, sorry. So if you search for George Floyd, on Google image search, there's about a handful of images of him himself, and there are a lot of images of the other things that have happened in the last week. And as you can imagine, with something as extreme and distressing as this, there were naturally protests in response to this, and it's a very important thing, peaceful protest, to make it clear why this is so wrong, why in America especially this is such an institutionalized issue of racism against black people by the police, especially people dying at the hands of the police. But also that's an issue here in Britain as well, and in many other places around the world. So obviously protests were very an important thing that had to happen. However, also there are instances of police brutality against protesters, peaceful protesters being attacked by police. There are horrific images of protesters being attacked. There are images of journalists being attacked. It's very important that both professional and citizen journalists document what's going on. We wouldn't have the video images of this murder if it wasn't for citizen journalists videoing them, being very brave and doing those important things. Those images of journalists being attacked, and then also there are images, quite bizarre images of people taking this opportunity to stir up all kinds of horrible things. People going in under the cover of being a protest and creating violence, which is the most sort of bizarre images you could possibly see. A kind of anarchism, and attacks on shops, looting, things which don't relate to the bigger political and important protests that are being done, but maybe are a kind of opportunism associated with it. But if you search for George Floyd, these are the images that come up. And that's why for this show, I think that the only image I'm going to use, and I think this is a respectful image that is an appropriate image, is this image here. And this is the image of the site of where he was attacked. And this has become a kind of memorial to him. And as you can see, it's very simple, but it's a very beautiful thing. There are flowers here, there are messages, and there are people respectfully contemplating the gravity of what has happened. And I think of all the images, and I think there will, historically, as people look back on this event, all kinds of images will be used to describe it. But I think this image is the most respectful image, because it shows that at the center of all of this was a person, and their life meant a lot to a lot of people. Yeah, and it is the murder of this person which is the most significant thing here, not the looting, not obviously the other things like the police brutality to protesters and journalists are important as well, because that shows the failure of the state and its American state and its ability to properly respond to this crisis. But I think this is the most important image, and this is hallowed ground, you know, and you can see that by the quality of this image and the way that people are standing, and the kind of reference to this space. It's very important to remember that, because fundamentally what has happened here is somebody has been killed, and they have been killed in the most terrifying way, because a police officer has simply picked on this person and taken their life, right? And you know, this, you have to think about what this would mean if this was something that happened to somebody, to someone in your family. It is the most terrifying thing when somebody is abused in this way by such a powerful force, and it sends a message, and that creates fear, and that is terrifying. But this is fundamental to what our cities and what our society is, because if people live in fear in our cities, if people live in fear that they could be abused, that their life could be terminated in this horrific way, then everything that we try to strive and to do as a society, anything that anybody wants to create, whether they're an architect, a designer, a software developer, product designer, doctor, all of the good things that we set out to do, you know, none of that really means anything if people live in fear. And that is why the implication of this event and the importance of the Black Lives Matter campaign are something which are relevant to every single person. And this is something that everybody needs to come together behind, in order that we can properly move beyond the divide and rule politics, which are all too present in our current day, in America, sadly in Britain, sadly in many other places. Now you probably think, you know, what am I doing? I'm in London and I'm weighing in on this thing of immense gravity. I mean, I'd certainly say that people I know very closely have been touched by similar incidents of abuse, state abuse. So this is something which I feel very personally. But also, as somebody in London, in 2011, there was a similar incident where Mark Duggan was killed by a police officer, and there followed protests, very reasonable protests. And then these protests were then hijacked, and then there were riots and there was looting, and then the kind of lasting legacy is these images of riots and looting, which actually go beyond the fact that what really was at the center of this thing was this issue of injustice, and the issue of injustice is the most important thing. So it's a thing that all of us need to think about, and especially when it comes to divide and rule politics. And I think it's very important when we look at Donald Trump's response to this crisis, because Donald Trump, rather than seeing this as something which affects all of us, has used this once again as a political moment to try and make himself appear as a strong man, who will stamp out any kind of disturbance rather than showing empathy or understanding for what is a genuine, massive problem in America and elsewhere. He has simply made this out to be a kind of divide and rule action. And I would argue that the divide and rule tendency is something which is extremely destructive. In Britain, following Mark Duggan's death and the 2011 riots, as they are described, we didn't have a response from our political elite which actually acknowledged this as a collective problem. We had a divide and rule response. So the riots were blamed on people who were opportunists and destroying the people who just wanted to destroy the fabric of our society, rather than acknowledging the fact that there are bigger issues behind this, such as inequality. And we had a political elite who continued to run policies such as the housing bill, which basically entrenched the kind of divides that exist between the wealthy and the unwealthy in our society. And also underfunding of the NHS, which increased the health inequalities, underplanning of the state responsiveness to crises, which have increased the depth of the coronavirus crisis that we have now. So the divide and rule tendency was all too strong. And I was listening to an interview with the former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown on the television early this morning, and he actually said something very interesting, which is what he said, that in our current crisis, we have a shared problem. Every single country has this problem, which is coronavirus. And the only solution to this problem is every single country working together to have a vaccine and to do everything we can to limit the destructive impact of this virus, right? And yet, despite the fact that we both have a shared problem and a shared goal, nobody is working together right now. And he argued that there should be a meeting of the G20 governments so they can get together and work together. And he also argued that the reason this meeting isn't happening is because Donald Trump doesn't want it to happen. So if you think about that, so you think that in the United States, Donald Trump is standing in the way of a united, empathic response to this crisis of George Floyd's murder. Donald Trump standing in the way of that. But also on the biggest possible scale, he also appears to be standing in the way of a global response to this coronavirus crisis. And this is because he understands the power, the sly and destructive power of divide and rule politics. And Gordon Brown went on to make the point that right now, the biggest problem, as he sees it, is tax havens. And the fact that tax havens hold $7 trillion of wealth without any scrutiny. And that right now we are going through enormous social, political and economic upheavals throughout the world, the biggest recession in history, all kinds of challenges about to be faced by people, often in developing parts of the world where the coronavirus is about to strike in the most horrific way. And at the same time, rather than dealing with the big problem, which is this huge amount of wealth, which has been squirreled away without any scrutiny, which could be used to help everybody and get us through this situation, Donald Trump is playing politics with this crisis in America and doing everything he can to deal with it in the wrong way, the most wrong way possible. And this has it's really emphasised by data which was published in Britain today by Public Health England, and it was a report into the impact of coronavirus on BAME communities. And what it found was that if you are of Bangladeshi ethnicity, you're around twice the risk of death than people of white British ethnicity. And that Chinese, Indian, Pakistani, Asian, Caribbean and other black ethnicity people are between 10 and 50% higher risk of death compared to white British people. And this is really, really significant because this shows us the divide and rule policy at work. And what this is all about health inequality. So some people in our society have much worse access to health than other people. right? And there are also other issues to do with employment, to do with pay, to do with housing, to do with air pollution, to do with many other things. But fundamentally, all of this comes down to health inequality, right? And this is a result of divide and rule policy, and we are seeing it. We're seeing it as we learn more and more and more about the British government's response to the coronavirus, in the fact that we are learning that effectively decisions were made which resulted in not enough care being taken in the movement of Covid-19 patients from hospitals to care homes, environments where the disease transmission is at a very high risk. And so we effectively see policies which appear, as what we're hearing from the journalists, to be policies which effectively decide to divide and rule the population, to effectively say that some parts of the population can be parcelled off and say, this is a collateral risk that these people are going to die of coronavirus, and we're going to make decisions. The British government's going to make decisions to save some people at the expense of other people. We can't move forward with policies that just say these people are going to be sacrificed, because that's divide and rule. And at the end, that boils down to what we saw with the death of George Floyd, right? So fundamentally, the coronavirus crisis shows that divide and rule policies are over. There's no future to them. Everything that's happening in America right now, every disturbing image you see, every sad image you see of what's happening there, is a testament to what should be the end of divide and rule politics. And that's the image in this memorial to George Floyd. And I agree with Gordon Brown, a big part of that is going to be taking back the money from the tax havens. It's our money. The money's created by people who work. It's not just there to sit on a tax haven island doing nothing. It needs to be there to solve these problems right now. So I say to you, please don't be too disturbed. Don't be too disturbed by all the images you see, and remember that at the core of this, there is an important story about somebody who was killed. And remember that together, and through campaigns like Black Lives Matter, we can move through this. We can move beyond divide and rule politics, and we can create a better world. Thank you for listening. Good night.